Is buy now, pay later bad for your credit score? Here's the direct answer, and it's not the one you've been given. As of 2026, FICO runs two purpose-built models, FICO Score 10 BNPL and FICO Score 10T BNPL, that fold your buy now, pay later activity directly into your credit file. In FICO's own 500,000-person study with the firm, roughly 85% of consumers saw their score move by less than 10 points once BNPL data was added. That sounds small. It isn't the whole story, and by the end of this video you'll know exactly why. I want to start with two numbers, because they're both true and they contradict each other, and almost nobody puts them side by side. Number 1, under 2%. That's roughly the charge-off rate, the official default rate, that buy now, pay later lenders report. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's own December 2025 data put it at 1.83% in the most recent year measured. By that number, BNPL looks safer than a credit card, which charges off around 4 times as often. Number 2, 47%. That's the share of BNPL users who told LendingTree's 2026 survey they'd paid late on a BNPL loan in the past year, up from 41% the year before and 34% the year before that. That's not a rounding gap. That's a number more than 20 times larger than the default rate, describing what looks like the same population. Both numbers are real. Both come from legitimate sources. And the fact that nobody puts them in the same sentence is exactly why so many people using these loans right now have no idea what's actually happening to their credit file. If you're watching this because you've got 2 or 3 buy now, pay later plans running right now because you just got a payment reminder that made your stomach drop, or because you've started hearing that something changed with how these loans hit your credit and nobody explained what, you're not paranoid. Something did change. It changed in the fall of 2025. It's still rolling out through 2026, and almost no one selling you the 0% interest, no credit check pitch is going to walk you through it. This video will. Why BNPL isn't a loan is the lie that's costing you. Let's deal with the sentence that made this whole industry possible. It's not really a loan, it's just splitting a payment into 4. That sentence isn't a lie in the legal sense. Pay in 4 BNPL products genuinely are structured differently from a credit card or a personal loan. Often no interest, often no hard credit pull at sign-up, often approved in the time it takes to read a paragraph of checkout terms. What makes it a lie in the way that actually matters to you is what that sentence implies by omission, that because it doesn't feel like debt, it doesn't behave like debt. It does. Here's the structural comparison worth sitting with, and we're going to come back to this in real depth in Chapter 7. A payday loan and a pay-in-4 BNPL plan are not the same product. Nobody's claiming that. But they share a specific mechanical DNA. Both are short duration, small dollar credit extended with minimal underwriting. Both are approved in minutes based on thin data, and both have historically existed in a reporting blind spot where the lender knows exactly what you owe and the rest of your creditors, and often you yourself, once you've stacked a few, do not. That blind spot has a name in the data now. It's called phantom debt, and we're spending all of Chapter 4 on it specifically because it's the mechanism behind almost every "how did this happen to me" story in the comment section of every BNPL video you've ever watched. For now, here's the shape of it. When you open a BNPL plan through Klarna, Afterpay, Affirm, or any of the other major providers, that obligation has, for most of BNPL's existence, not consistently shown up on your credit report the way a credit card balance does. You could be carrying 3 or 4 active plans, each one individually small, each one invisible to the next lender evaluating whether to extend you credit. A mortgage underwriter, an auto lender, even a landlord running a credit check would see a version of your finances with a gap in it. Not a lie exactly. Just missing data. That's the part that made BNPL feel free. If it's not on the report, it's not touching your score, so it doesn't feel like the same category of decision as swiping a credit card you're already close to maxing out. Behaviorally, that's a meaningful difference. Multiple studies on point-of-sale financing show people underestimate the weight of a purchase when it's been sliced into 4 small numbers instead of 1 bigger one. Structurally, though, the money owed is identical. You still owe the total. You've just been given a psychological discount on how heavy it feels. Here's where it stops being a psychology problem and becomes a math problem, and it's the bridge this entire video is built around. that invisibility is ending. As of fall 2025, FICO, the company whose scores underpin the overwhelming majority of U.S. lending decisions, launched FICO Score 10 BNPL and FICO Score 10T BNPL, the first mainstream credit scoring models built specifically to incorporate buy now, pay later data as bureaus begin furnishing it. We're going to spend the entirety of Chapter 5 inside those models, how they work, what they weight, why FICO chose to group your BNPL loans together instead of counting each one separately. And in Chapter 9, we're going deep into FICO's own simulation data, the study behind that 85% of consumers, plus or minus 10 points number I gave you in the hook, because the honest headline is more nuanced than either BNPL will wreck your score or BNPL is basically harmless. It's neither. It depends entirely on which side of that 10-point line you land on, and that depends on exactly the behaviors we're about to spend the next 30 minutes unpacking. So the lie isn't BNPL isn't a loan. Legally, structurally, in the fine print, that's often technically accurate. The lie is the implication riding on top of it, that because it doesn't look like debt, it doesn't function like debt in your financial life. It does. It always has. The only thing that's changing in 2025 and 2026 is who else can see it. In the next chapter, we're going to sit inside those two numbers from the hook, 47% and under 2%, and take them apart piece by piece, because understanding exactly what each one is actually measuring is the key that unlocks everything else in this video, including the real answer to whether your BNPL habit is currently doing damage you can't see yet. The numbers nobody reconciles: 2% default rate versus 47% late payment rate. Which one is real? Both numbers are real. That's the uncomfortable part. This isn't a case of one source being wrong and one being right. It's three different organizations measuring three different things, all calling their measurement how often people don't pay on time, and none of them technically lying to you. Let's take them one at a time, because the gap between them is the whole story. The first number is a charge-off rate, and it comes from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's report published in December 2025. A charge-off is the point where a lender gives up, writes the debt off as a loss because it's gone unpaid long enough that they no longer expect to collect it. According to that CFPB data, BNPL's charge-off rate was 1.83% in 2023, down from 2.63% the year before. For comparison, credit card charge-offs at U.S. commercial banks were running north of 4% in the same period, more than double. By this measurement, BNPL genuinely does look like one of the safer forms of consumer credit in America right now. The second number is a self-reported late payment rate, and this is where the 47% comes from. LendingTree's 2026 Buy Now, Pay Later report, based on a March 2026 survey. 47% of BNPL users told LendingTree they'd paid late on a BNPL loan at some point in the past year. That's up from 41% the year before and 34% the year before that, a 13-point climb in just 2 years. This isn't measuring money that got written off. It's measuring people who missed a due date at all, whether they cured it the next day or 3 weeks later. And there's a third figure sitting quietly in the middle of these two, which most coverage skips entirely: the industry's own reported delinquency definition, also sitting under 2%, but measuring something narrower than the CFPB's charge-off number and broader than ever paid a day late. 3 definitions. 3 numbers. 1 population. Here's the mechanism that reconciles all of it, and it's simpler than it sounds once you see it laid out. Most late payments get cured fast. LendingTree's 2026 data found that 72% of people who paid late said their most recent late payment was no more than about a week overdue. A payment that's 3 or 4 days late gets caught by an auto-pay retry or a manually entered card number and clears before the account rolls into serious delinquency. That shows up in the 47% number because the person genuinely was late and genuinely remembers it. It almost never shows up in the charge-off number because the lender got paid. Late and lost are not the same category, and BNPL's whole risk profile lives in the gap between them. So, which one is real? They both are. The CFPB's 1.83% tells you how much money BNPL lenders are actually losing. The 47% tells you how much financial strain BNPL users are actually carrying. A lender cares more about the first number. You, watching this because you've got your own BNPL plans running right now, should care more about the second because a 72% cured within a week pattern is exactly the kind of behavior that used to be invisible to anyone but the lender collecting the payment. And as we're about to spend the next several chapters proving, that stopped being true in 2025. This is worth sitting with for one more second, because it's the single most misused statistic in every BNPL explainer you've probably already watched. Videos that want to scare you cite the 47% and call it a default rate. It isn't. Videos that want to sell you on BNPL cite the sub 2% and call it the whole risk picture. It isn't either. Citing the self-reported late payment figure as if it's an official delinquency rate isn't a difference of opinion or framing choice. It's a factual error, and it's one that's been repeated across enough finance content that it's become a kind of accepted shorthand nobody bothers to correct. You now know both numbers, and you know what each one is actually measuring. That puts you ahead of most of what's been published on this topic in the last year. But neither number, on its own, tells you what a stacked-up pattern of near misses does once it starts getting reported to a bureau under a scoring model built specifically to catch it, which is exactly where we're headed next. Inside the CFPB data, what default actually means at 6 major lenders. Every number we've used so far, the 1.83%, the 47%, all of it, ultimately traces back to a small set of primary sources. And the most important one is a December 2025 CFPB report built on data pulled directly from 6 companies: Affirm, Cash App Afterpay, Klarna, PayPal, Sezzle, and Zip. Together, those 6 represent roughly 94% of the U.S. pay-in-4 BNPL market. When people say the CFPB found, this is almost always the report they mean, and it's worth understanding exactly how it was built, because the methodology explains why the numbers look the way they do. The CFPB didn't survey consumers for this one. It used its supervisory authority to compel the 6 lenders themselves to hand over loan-level performance data, originations, repayment timing, charge-offs, the whole servicing picture, sourced directly from the ledgers, not from what people remember or admit to on a phone survey. That's an important distinction from the lending tree number we spent all of Chapter 2 dissecting. Lending tree asked people. The CFPB pulled the books. And the books tell a growth story that's almost hard to process at scale. BNPL loan originations across these 6 lenders went from roughly 20 million in 2019 to 336 million by 2023, nearly a 17-fold increase in 4 years. In 2023 alone, the CFPB counted about 54 million Americans who used a BNPL product from one of these 6 providers, with an average loan size around $135 and the average total amount an individual borrower financed across the year rising 14% to $848 from 2022 to 2023. So, what does default actually mean inside this dataset? This is the piece almost no consumer-facing coverage explains clearly, and it matters because default isn't one universal event. It's a definition each lender sets, tied to how long a payment has gone unpaid and at what point the lender stops expecting to collect it. The CFPB's report doesn't force all 6 companies into one identical default clock. It aggregates each lender's own charge-off reporting, then presents the blended result. That blended result is the 1.83% figure from Chapter 2. It's real, it's drawn from actual loan books rather than self-report, and it's also, by design, an average sitting on top of 6 somewhat different internal definitions of when a loan is officially given up on. Here's why that matters to you specifically, and it's the thread I want you holding on to for the rest of this video. An aggregate default rate tells you about the system. It does not tell you about your file. If you're running loans through 2 or 3 of these 6 providers simultaneously, and by the CFPB's own numbers, most heavy users are, each provider is independently deciding, based on its own definition and its own data, whether you're a risk. None of them, historically, has had visibility into what the other 5 know about you. That's not a flaw in any one company's underwriting. It's a structural gap between 6 separate ledgers that, until very recently, never talked to each other. And that gap is exactly what we're diving into next. The phantom debt problem. Why our BNPL loans were invisible until now. Phantom debt isn't a metaphor. It's the accurate technical description of what happened to a specific slice of American consumer debt for most of the last decade, and understanding the mechanism is the key that unlocks everything else in this video, including why the FICO changes in chapters 5 and 9 landed as hard as they did. Here's how it worked mechanically. When you open a traditional credit card or a personal loan, the lender reports that account to one or more of the three major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, as a matter of routine. That reporting is what builds the file a mortgage lender, an auto lender, or a landlord pulls when they're deciding whether to extend you credit. For most of BNPL's history, that reporting step for pay-in-4 loans simply didn't happen consistently. Not because it was hidden or fraudulent, because the infrastructure for it hadn't been built, and the short duration, high-volume nature of pay-in-4 loans didn't fit neatly into a reporting system designed around long-term revolving accounts. The result? You could open a BNPL plan, and unless you missed enough payments to get sent to collections, it would frequently never touch your credit file at all. Not a positive mark. Not a negative mark. Nothing. It existed entirely in the lender's own internal ledger, real money you genuinely owed, invisible to every other financial institution in your life. This is where the structural risk actually lives, and it's worth being precise about it rather than dramatic. It's not that any single BNPL loan is dangerous. A $135 pay-in-4 plan, paid on schedule, is a genuinely low-risk piece of credit. That's part of why the CFPB's charge-off data looks as clean as it does. The risk is what happens when that invisibility meets the CFPB's own finding from its earlier 2025 report. 63% of BNPL borrowers had opened multiple simultaneous loans at some point during the year, and a third of those did so across more than one provider. Run 3 plans through 3 different companies, and you can be carrying several $100s a month in obligations that no single lender, and often no single budgeting app, has a complete picture of. Each individual company sees its own slice. Nobody sees the whole stack, including, in a lot of cases documented by researchers, the borrower. That last part is what the Richmond Fed flagged as a genuine point of concern in its 2026 economic brief on BNPL. Much of the risk isn't visible in aggregate default statistics because it's distributed across ledgers that don't talk to each other. A consumer can look financially stable to every individual lender they're dealing with while carrying a debt load that, added up, tells a different story entirely. That era is ending, and it's ending specifically now, in 2025 and 2026. A firm began reporting BNPL loan data to the major credit bureaus during 2025. Other large providers have moved in the same direction, some more cautiously. A Reuters analysis in 2025 noted that certain BNPL companies had grown notably hesitant about handing bureau data over once they understood what broader visibility would mean for their own users' approval odds elsewhere. But the direction of travel is set. The phantom debt era wasn't a permanent feature of BNPL. It was a temporary gap between a product that scaled faster than the reporting infrastructure built to track it, and that gap is closing loan by loan, provider by provider, through exactly the kind of scoring model we're about to walk into. The FICO earthquake, how Score 10 BNPL and 10T BNPL are rewriting the rules. This is the chapter that answers the question in the video's title, so I want to walk through it slowly and get the mechanics exactly right, because most coverage of this launch either oversimplifies it into a scare headline or buries the actual detail under a press release's worth of corporate phrasing. On June 23, 2025, FICO announced 2 new scoring models, FICO Score 10 BNPL and FICO Score 10T BNPL. These are not tweaks to an existing score. They're the first credit scores from a major scoring provider built specifically to incorporate buy now, pay later data as bureaus begin furnishing it. The direct technical response to the phantom debt problem we just spent chapter 4 unpacking. Both are extensions of the existing FICO Score 10 family, which was originally released back in 2020, and both were slated to roll out starting fall 2025. Here's the distinction that actually matters for you. FICO Score 10 is what you'd think of as a snapshot, a picture of your credit file as it stands right now. FICO Score 10T, the T standing for trended, looks instead at how your balances and payment behavior have moved over roughly the past 24 months. Vice President Dave Schellenberger has described it as the difference between a single photo and a time-lapse. Someone who's been steadily paying down balances looks meaningfully better under 10T than someone whose balances have stayed flat or crept upward, even if both people show an identical balance on the exact day the score gets pulled. The BNPL versions of both models layer your buy now, pay later activity into that same framework. Now, the engineering detail that made this launch genuinely different from just bolting BNPL data onto an old formula. FICO ran a year-long joint study specifically to figure out how to handle a behavior pattern unique to BNPL borrowers, the tendency to open a large number of these loans within a very short window. A shopper doing holiday purchasing across 4 merchants in 3 weeks might open 4 separate Pay in 4 plans almost simultaneously. If a scoring model treated each one the way it treats a separate credit card application, that pattern alone could tank a score, punishing completely normal, low-risk BNPL behavior as if it were a sign of desperation. FICO's solution, in their own language, was to develop an approach that aggregates separate BNPL loans together when calculating certain in-model variables, treating a cluster of small Pay in 4 plans more like one grouped signal than 4 independent red flags. That single design choice is doing a lot of the work behind the reassuring numbers we're about to spend all of Chapter 9 unpacking in detail. I want to be precise about where this stands as of when this video is being made because FICO announced it and your lender is using it are 2 different sentences. Adoption of new FICO models has always been slow. Vice President Dave Schellenberger has noted it can take months, and often longer for the largest lenders, before a new model actually gets built into a lender's underwriting stack. Right now, most non-mortgage lending decisions in the U.S. still run on FICO Score 8, a model released back in 2009. Mortgage lending is moving faster than most other categories. FICO indicated mortgage lenders would be required to provide the trended FICO 10T starting in the 4th quarter of 2025, which is meaningfully ahead of general market adoption. But broad adoption of the BNPL-specific versions across credit cards, auto loans, and personal loans is still in progress through 2026, rolling out lender by lender rather than flipping on everywhere at once. Here's what that means practically, and it's the honest, unhyped version of the answer you came for. Your BNPL activity is not universally hitting your score today, on the date you're watching this. But the infrastructure to do exactly that has been built, tested on real data, and is actively rolling out. The question isn't whether this happens. It's already happening. The question that actually matters to you is what it finds when it looks at your file, and that depends heavily on a pattern the CFPB has already quantified in detail. How many of these loans you're running at once? That's exactly where we're headed next. The loan stacking trap. What happens when you run 3+ BNPL plans at once? This is the chapter for anyone who's currently running more than one of these plans. And if that's you, I want to walk you through exactly what the data says is happening, without exaggerating it, and without letting you off easy either. Start with the baseline number. According to LendingTree's 2026 report, 63% of BNPL users say they've held multiple BNPL loans at the same time. That's the majority. Running more than one plan simultaneously isn't an edge case or a warning sign on its own. It's closer to normal behavior for anyone actively using these products. Within that group, though, there's a meaningful split. 25% of users, up from 23% just a year earlier, say they've juggled 3 or more loans at once. That's the number that starts to matter, and it's climbing. Who's stacking hardest? Gen Z and millennials, by a clear margin. 29% of Gen Z BNPL users and 28% of millennials report having held 3 or more loans simultaneously, well above older age groups. If you're in either of those cohorts and you've got a phone full of payment reminders from 3 different apps right now, the data says you have a great deal of company. That doesn't make it risk-free. It makes it common, which is a different thing. Here's where the CFPB's own research, cited by the Richmond Fed, gets specific about why stacking matters structurally, not just statistically. Because most of these loans have historically gone unreported, no single BNPL provider, and often no traditional lender either, could see your full obligation across all the plans you're running. Independent analysis from consumer lending data firms has gone further. One industry data provider found that BNPL stacking correlates directly with broader credit usage. Consumers already carrying 3 or more traditional credit products were far more likely to also be running 2, 3, or more BNPL loans at the same time. That same analysis found that the most active BNPL stackers, 3 or more concurrent plans, were carrying a payment-to-income ratio roughly double that of similar borrowers with no BNPL exposure at all, and that BNPL debt correlated with a meaningfully higher likelihood of defaulting on some obligation, BNPL or otherwise. That's the mechanism worth understanding. Stated plainly, stacking BNPL loans doesn't cause financial stress out of nowhere. It tends to travel alongside financial stress that's already present, and it multiplies the number of due dates you're tracking without multiplying your income to match. 4 separate plans means 4 separate payment dates for separate providers who can each independently charge a late fee, and as we covered in Chapter 4, until very recently, for ledgers that had no idea the other 3 existed. This is exactly the behavior FICO built its aggregation treatment to catch, which we talked through in Chapter 5. The model doesn't punish you once for each plan the way an old scoring system might have. But aggregation isn't the same as invisibility. It means the model looks at your BNPL activity as a cluster and asks a more sophisticated question. Not how many accounts do you have, but what does your pattern across that cluster actually look like? And the single most damaging thing that pattern can contain isn't the number of loans. It's what happens when one of them slips, which is a mechanism that behaves less like a credit card and more like something you might not expect. That's the comparison we're tackling head-on next. The payday loan parallel, structural similarities data won't let you ignore. I want to be careful with this comparison because it's the one that gets thrown around the loosest in BNPL content, usually as a scare tactic with no structural backing behind it. So, let's actually do the structural work instead of just asserting the headline. Here's what a payday loan actually costs. The CFPB's own consumer guidance uses a standard example, a $15 fee per $100 borrowed on a typical 2-week term. Run that through the annualization math, and you land at an APR of almost 400%. Depending on the state and the lender, real-world payday APRs commonly range from roughly 300% up past 600%. For comparison, the CFPB notes that credit card APRs typically run somewhere between about 12% and 30%. Payday loans aren't just more expensive than mainstream credit, they operate in an entirely different order of magnitude. Standard pay-in-4 BNPL, by contrast, is usually genuinely interest-free if you pay on schedule. That's not spin. It's structurally true, and it's the single biggest reason BNPL doesn't deserve to be flattened into secretly the same as a payday loan. The cost mechanisms are different. The APRs, when interest applies at all, are different. This is not a hidden 400% loan wearing a friendly checkout button. So where's the actual parallel? Not in the pricing, in the structure of the decision itself, and this is the part that data actually supports rather than just implies. Both products share 4 specific mechanical traits. They're small dollar, they're short duration, they involve minimal underwriting, often no traditional credit check at sign-up, and approval happens in minutes rather than days. That combination is exactly what makes both products fast to say yes to and, historically, easy to layer without anyone noticing you'd done it more than once. The CFPB's own director, in the agency's original 2021 inquiry into BNPL, described it as a modern version of the old layaway model, except, in his framing, the consumer gets the product immediately while also taking on the debt immediately, rather than paying it off before taking the item home. That inversion of layaway's old sequencing is the structural DNA payday loans and BNPL genuinely do share, speed of access outpacing the borrower's ability to feel the weight of the obligation. The failure mode is where the parallel gets sharper. With payday loans, missing your due date typically triggers a rollover. You pay a fee just to push the deadline out, and that fee stacks on top of the original balance, which is the well-documented mechanism behind the payday debt cycle advocacy groups have been flagging for years. BNPL doesn't have a rollover in that same form, but it has its own version of consequence on mispayment, a late fee, assessed by that specific provider, on top of whatever obligations you're already carrying with your other providers, if you're one of the 63% running multiple plans. Different mechanism, same underlying shape. A missed payment doesn't just cost you the payment. It costs you more than the payment, at the exact moment you're least equipped to absorb an extra cost. That's the honest version of the payday parallel, not identical products, not the same price tag, but the same behavioral trapdoor. fast approval, thin scrutiny, and a penalty structure that activates precisely when your finances are already tightest. Understanding who actually falls through that trapdoor isn't a matter of guessing. The data on it is specific, and it's not who most people assume. Who's actually getting hurt? The demographic reality behind the convenience pitch. The marketing pitch for BNPL has always been aimed at a specific psychological profile, the person who wants something now and can comfortably afford to spread the cost. The data on who's actually using these products and who's actually struggling with them tells a more complicated story, and it's worth separating those two groups carefully because uses BNPL and is being harmed by BNPL are not the same population. Start with sheer adoption. LendingTree's 2026 data puts overall usage at 47% of Americans having used a BNPL service at least once. But that average flattens real differences. Parents with young children are far above that baseline. LendingTree found nearly 7 in 10, 69%, of parents with young kids have used BNPL, and separately, 62% of parents say they need these loans just to make ends meet, the highest share of any group surveyed. Gen Z isn't far behind on usage, at 61%, but sits well above everyone else on stacking multiple loans at once. And notably, this isn't purely a low-income phenomenon. 59% of people earning $100,000 or more a year report having used BNPL too, which tells you this has moved well past being a workaround exclusively for people who can't otherwise afford things. So who's actually getting hurt as opposed to just using the product? That's where the picture narrows. Industry research on BNPL borrower profiles has found that a substantial majority of BNPL borrowers, over 60% by some estimates, fall into subprime or near subprime credit categories, and that this group tends to already be carrying high credit card utilization, often in the 60 to 66% range, compared to roughly 34% among non-BNPL users. Separately, one analysis found renters are meaningfully more likely to use BNPL than homeowners, and that nearly 3/4 of BNPL users, about 72.6%, earn less than $75,000 a year. The Federal Reserve's own research has identified BNPL as most widely used among low- and middle-income Black and Hispanic consumers, women, millennials, and Gen Z specifically. Put those pieces together and a coherent shape emerges. BNPL usage broadly cuts across income levels. It's genuinely mainstream now, not a fringe product. But BNPL harm concentrates specifically among people who are already carrying financial strain before they open their first plan. Thinner credit files, higher existing utilization, tighter monthly margins. That's consistent with what the CFPB's original framing of the audience was built around, and it's consistent with something we've touched on throughout this video. BNPL doesn't manufacture financial fragility out of nothing. It tends to find people who already have some, and it hands them a tool that's genuinely useful when margins are thin, right up until the moment 3 of those tools are running at once and one payment gets missed. If you're a parent covering groceries with a BNPL plan, or you're carrying multiple pay-in-4 loans because your paycheck and your bills don't line up as cleanly as you'd like, the data says you're not an outlier and you're not reckless. You're the exact profile this product was quietly built around, whether or not that was the marketing pitch. What matters now is understanding precisely what your usage pattern is about to mean under the new scoring reality we spent chapters 5 and 9 unpacking, and specifically, what happens to your file the moment one of those loans slips even a few days late, which is where we're headed next. The plus or minus 10-point reality check. What FICO's own simulation found. This is the chapter that pays off the promise from the hook, so let's go through the actual study, not the headline version of it. FICO didn't build its BNPL scoring models blind. Before launching FICO Score 10 BNPL and 10 TBNPL, the company ran a 12-month joint study with a firm, reviewing credit data from more than 500,000 consumers who had taken out at least one Affirm BNPL loan, comparing them against a benchmark population without one. FICO simulated what would happen if that BNPL data had been folded into each consumer's credit file, using the aggregation treatment we talked through back in Chapter 5, grouping BNPL loans together rather than scoring each one as an independent new account. Here's what the simulation found, stated exactly the way FICO reported it. For over 85% of consumers in the study, the inclusion of BNPL data produced a score change of less than 10 points in either direction, and affect FICO itself compared to what typically happens when someone opens any new account. That's the number I gave you in the hook, and now you have the full context behind it. For the large majority of BNPL users, this isn't a credit score earthquake. It's roughly the same sized ripple you'd feel from opening one new credit card. Now, the part that gets left out of almost every headline built on this study: what happened to the other group, people running 5 or more Affirm loans simultaneously, the heaviest stackers in the dataset. You might expect that group to be where the damage concentrated. The study found close to the opposite. FICO's vice president for B2B scores, Julie May, described it directly. The simulated study showed positive benefits for roughly 2/3 of consumers, particularly those with 5 or more BNPL loans, with most in that heavy usage group seeing either higher scores or no change at all. That result held up consistently enough that FICO's newer study essentially confirmed a smaller 2022 analysis, with one notable difference. The earlier study had found scores were slightly more likely to move downward, while the larger, more recent studies skewed more positive. I want to be precise about what that finding actually proves, because it's easy to overread it into loan stacking is fine, don't worry about it, and that's not what the data supports. What the study measured was the effect of on-time BNPL repayment being added to a credit file. For people managing multiple loans responsibly, having that repayment history counted for something, rather than staying invisible, tended to help. That's a genuinely different question from what happens when repayment isn't on time, which the study also addressed, more briefly but unambiguously. Missed BNPL payments carry the same downside risk any other missed payment carries once they're part of your file, and the risk compounds specifically for people already running multiple simultaneous loans, because a single missed paycheck now has more than one place to go wrong at once. So the honest, complete version of the plus or minus 10-point finding is this: it's real, it's not spin, and it should genuinely ease some of the anxiety this video opened with. For the vast majority of people using BNPL responsibly, even people stacking several loans at once, the credit score consequence of FICO's new models is modest and often mildly positive. But modest for most people paying on time, and modest for you specifically, regardless of what happens next, are two different promises, and only the first one is backed by this study. What actually determines which side of that plus or minus 10-point line you land on isn't how many loans you're running. It's what happens the moment one of them goes even a little bit late, which, as it turns out, doesn't behave the way most people assume, and it's a mechanism worth understanding in detail before you assume a few days late is harmless just because it feels that way in the moment. The late payment death spiral: how just a week late compounds. Here's the phrase that comes up constantly in the comment sections of every BNPL video: it was only a few days late, it's not a big deal. I want to take that claim seriously because the data actually agrees with it, and then show you exactly where that same claim stops being true. Start with what's genuinely reassuring. LendingTree's 2026 data found that among BNPL users who've paid late, 72% said their most recent late payment was no more than about a week overdue. That's the majority experience, by a wide margin. Most lateness in this category isn't someone disappearing on a debt. It's someone missing an autopay retry, forgetting which of 3 or 4 due dates was which, or being a few days short on payday timing and catching up almost immediately. That pattern is exactly what explains the gap we spent Chapter 2 unpacking: a 47% self-reported late payment rate sitting on top of a sub-2% actual charge-off rate. Most lateness gets cured before it becomes anything more than an inconvenience and, historically, a small fee. Here's where it's just a few days stops being the whole story, and it's the mechanical detail that makes 2025 and 2026 genuinely different from BNPL's first several years of existence. Under the credit reporting standards that govern how FICO scoring models, including the new BNPL versions, treat a late payment, the meaningful threshold isn't a few days. It's 30 days past due. That's the point at which a missed payment typically crosses from internal late fee territory into reportable delinquency on a credit file, the same threshold that's applied to credit cards, auto loans, and virtually every other form of reported consumer credit. A payment that's 3, 5, even 10 days late generally doesn't cross that line. NerdWallet's coverage of the new FICO 10 models is direct about what happens once it does. The penalty for going 30 days past due is described as even harsher under the new scoring models than under the FICO scores most lenders are still using today. That's the actual death spiral mechanism, and it's worth naming precisely because it's not really about the calendar. It's about what compounds once you cross that line. First, the 30-day mark on one BNPL loan doesn't erase the fact that, per Chapter 6, you may be carrying 2 or 3 others simultaneously, and a paycheck disruption severe enough to push one plan past 30 days is frequently severe enough to threaten the others on the same rough timeline. Second, unlike the earlier, pre-reporting era of BNPL we covered in Chapter 4, that 30-day mark can now actually land on your file under FICO's BNPL-aware models, where it doesn't just cost you a late fee, it costs you standing with every future lender who pulls that score, for as long as that mark stays on your report. There is real, data-backed good news buried in here too, and it's worth stating plainly. BNPL lenders appear genuinely willing to work with borrowers who ask. LendingTree's tracker data found that the overwhelming majority of people who asked a BNPL provider to waive a late fee, somewhere in the high 80s percentage-wise, got that fee reduced or waived entirely. The gap between a few days late and 30 days past due, reported, and compounding across multiple accounts isn't inevitable. It's a gap you can actively manage, specifically by not letting silence be your default response to a missed date. Reaching out before day 30, not after, is the single highest leverage move available to you inside this entire mechanism. So the honest synthesis of this chapter: most lateness is genuinely minor, and the data backs that up. But the new reporting infrastructure has installed a specific, harder threshold at 30 days that didn't functionally exist for most BNPL loans a few years ago, and if you're already running multiple plans, one disrupted paycheck has more chances than ever to push more than one loan across that line at the same time. Understanding that threshold is useful. What regulators are and aren't doing to address the structural risk underneath it is a different question entirely, and it's one worth being clear-eyed about before we get to what you can actually do about all of this. What regulators still aren't fixing, and why that matters to you. Here's the regulatory picture as it actually stands right now, and it's more fragmented than most explainers let on, which itself is the problem worth understanding. In May 2024, the CFPB under the Biden administration issued an interpretive rule classifying pay-in-4 BNPL providers as card issuers under Regulation Z, the regulation implementing the Truth in Lending Act. Practically, that would have meant BNPL users got the same protections credit card holders already have: the right to dispute charges, request refunds on returned items, and receive periodic billing statements. That rule never made it to full maturity. It was challenged in court by the Financial Technology Association. The CFPB's own leadership changed in early 2025, and by May 2025 the Bureau formally withdrew it. In June 2025, the CFPB went a step further and said it did not intend to reissue any revised version, stating plainly that applying credit card-style open-end regulations to what are structurally closed-end, typically no finance charge loans was, in its own words, an ill fit that placed a substantial burden on providers for limited consumer benefit. So, at the federal level, as of when this video is being made, there is no BNPL-specific rule in effect. That's not a gap that opened accidentally. It's the direct result of a regulatory reversal, and it's left the responsibility for oversight falling to 2 other layers: states and the industry's own furnishing practices. States have moved to fill exactly that gap. New York enacted the first state law specifically licensing and regulating BNPL providers, with the Department of Financial Services proposing detailed implementing rules in February 2026 covering fee limits, disclosure requirements, and dispute processes. Illinois followed with its own licensing bill. California and Maryland already license BNPL lenders under existing consumer credit statutes. And separately, a coalition of state attorneys general, 7 states, led by Connecticut and North Carolina, opened their own inquiry into major BNPL providers in late 2025, seeking information the federal government was no longer positioned to collect. The National Consumer Law Center has been blunt about why, with the CFPB's oversight capacity reduced, state-level protection has become, in their words, especially important right now. Here's the piece that connects directly back to everything we've covered in this video, And it's the detail that actually matters most for your credit files specifically. Credit bureau reporting by BNPL firms remains inconsistent and largely voluntary. As of the most recent Congressional Research Service analysis, only one major BNPL provider universally furnishes pay-in-4 data to credit bureaus, even as FICO's new scoring models are increasingly built to use exactly that data the moment it arrives. That means the entire system we spent chapters 5 through 9 walking through, FICO Score 10 BNPL, the aggregation treatment, the plus or minus 10-point simulation, is rolling out into a reporting environment that isn't uniform. Some of your BNPL activity may already be reaching your file. Some of it may not be for a while yet, depending entirely on which provider you're using and whether that provider has chosen to furnish data. That inconsistency cuts both ways, and it's worth being honest about both directions. It means you can't assume every BNPL provider you're using is currently invisible to your credit file the way BNPL loans mostly were a few years ago. A firm, for one, began reporting in 2025. But it also means you can't assume uniform protection either. Without an active federal rule, your dispute rights, refund protections, and fee structures currently depend heavily on which state you live in and which specific provider you're using, not on a single consistent national standard the way credit card holders have had for decades. The practical upshot: the system is mid-transition, not settled. Federal oversight pulled back right as the scoring infrastructure to track BNPL activity was being built out. That combination, thinner federal rules, uneven bureau reporting, state-by-state patchwork protection, is exactly the environment you're operating in if you're using BNPL right now. Which means the responsibility for managing this well, at least for the time being, sits more with you than with any regulator. Here's exactly how to do that. The Protection Protocol, a data-backed framework for using BNPL without getting trapped. Everything in this video has been building toward this chapter, so let's make it concrete. Not generic advice, a framework built directly from the specific mechanisms we've spent the last 30 minutes documenting. 1. Know your real stacking number, not your guess. Chapter 6 showed that 63% of BNPL users carry multiple loans at once, and most people don't have an accurate running total across providers because, as Chapter 4 covered, these loans were built to live in separate, disconnected ledgers. Pull up every BNPL app you have right now and write down every active balance and every due date in one place. This single step closes the exact visibility gap that made phantom debt possible in the first place. 2. Treat the 30-day line as sacred, not the due date itself. Chapter 10 was clear that most lateness, 72% of it, clears within about a week and functionally doesn't hurt you. But the 30-day mark is where FICO's new BNPL-aware models start treating a missed payment the same way they'd treat a missed credit card payment, and Chapter 5 showed those models are actively rolling out through 2026. A few days late, cure it and move on. Approaching day 20 or 25 with no plan, that's the moment to act, not the moment to hope it resolves itself. 3. Call before you're late, not after. Chapter 10's data on late fee waivers was one of the most useful numbers in this entire video. The overwhelming majority of people who asked for a fee waiver got one, at least partially. That leverage is strongest before a payment is missed, when you can request a due date shift, not after, when you're negotiating from a weaker position. 4. Use the aggregation logic in your own favor. Chapter 5 explained that FICO now groups your BNPL loans together rather than penalizing each one independently, which means the model is specifically built to reward a pattern of several small, well-managed plans over one badly managed one. If you're going to run multiple loans, the data suggests consistency across all of them matters more than minimizing how many you open. 5. Watch which providers are actually reporting. Chapter 11 established that BNPL bureau reporting is still inconsistent. Some providers furnish data, most don't yet. That cuts both ways. A provider that isn't reporting isn't helping you build credit through on-time payments, but it also isn't the one that can hurt you if you occasionally slip. Know which of your providers falls into which category because it changes how much urgency each due date deserves. None of this requires giving up BNPL entirely. Nothing in the data we've walked through, not the CFPB's charge-off numbers, not FICO's plus or minus 10-point study, not the demographic reality from Chapter 8, supports the idea that BNPL is inherently dangerous for someone using it deliberately. What the data supports is narrower and more useful than that. BNPL rewards visibility and punishes invisibility, and for the first time in this product's history, the tools to stay visible to yourself are finally catching up with the tools your lenders now have to see you. We open this video with two numbers that seem to contradict each other, under 2% and 47%, and by now you understand exactly why they don't. You know what FICO's models are actually built to do, what the CFPB's own data says about default versus delinquency, and what your specific stacking pattern means under a scoring system that's still rolling out around you in real time. That's more clarity than most people managing multiple BNPL loans right now are working with, and if this helped, it'll help someone else you know who's quietly doing the same math on their phone at 11 p.m. Here's the thing worth sitting with as you close this tab, though. Everything we just covered protects your future borrowing power, your score, your file, your standing with the next lender who pulls it. It does nothing for the money sitting in your checking account right this second. And that idle cash, structured the wrong way, is quietly costing you more than a missed BNPL payment ever would. That's next. If you want to see exactly how, that's the next video, the 5-minute credit score fix banks don't advertise.